Okay, good evening, everyone. Nice to see so many people on a Friday evening, also a lot of familiar faces. Thanks for showing up. It is my pleasure to welcome all of you here and also online, because we're streaming this live, to this inaugural lecture of the 𝗙𝗀 𝗙𝗀. We have a special guest this evening, Barnabas Calder, who's sitting over there. Maybe first a few words on the 𝗙𝗀 𝗙𝗀. It's a collective or collaborative effort between the Brussels Center for Urban Studies, the Brussels Academy, and also with the support of 𝗍𝗃𝐼𝑐onnect. My name is 𝗤𝗍𝗏. I'm affiliated to the 𝗍𝗏 Brussels, the Department of Architectural Engineering, and I'm also a board member of the Brussels Center for Urban Studies. I am really honored and grateful that I have to look where they are. Bas and Lena have entrusted me with, or given me the opportunity to curate this year's lecture series. And the premise was quite simple. You can invite 6 internationally renowned scholars that you would like to invite to Brussels to give a lecture, going into the nexus between urban studies and some of your own research activities and teaching activities in the field of architectural and construction history and heritage. What's the catch, was my question, but there's actually no catch. So it is just that 6 people that enlighten us with their expertise. So for this series, I have proposed to look into a central theme that fosters a dialogue between past, present, and future, looking how the built environment has been constructed, how it has evolved, how architectural, social, cultural values have been embedded in it. So looking backwards, rewind, but also looking forward. What is the meaning of those layers, and how can they help us to potentially transform the future also? So to take you on this journey in time and in space, I've invited 6 scholars. 𝗻𝗿𝗄𝗏 is coming, Mercedes Follet, Tom Leslie, Miles Glendening, and Sabine Barle. But we kick off the series tonight with Barnabas Calder. So he serves as the head of the History of Architecture Research Cluster at the University of Liverpool, and he also holds the role of trustee within the Society of Architectural Historians of Great Britain. And in his recent book, which I hope you will all already have or buy soon after this lecture, it is entitled Architecture from Prehistory to Climate Emergency. He explores the history of architecture through the lens of energy. This is quite an innovative approach in the field. And I would like to quote James Campbell, who is the head of architecture at the University of Cambridge and also an esteemed colleague within the field of construction history. He aptly summarized this work saying, finally, a book to replace Pevsner's standard history of architecture. Calder retells the story of architecture for the climate change generation. Because indeed the current climate crisis really compels us to revisit architecture and architectural history and urban history from a different perspective. And I don't want to delve too much into the details because I don't want to steal his thunder. But I particularly like the title of chapter 9 in this book. It is a rephrasing of a famous quote by Louis Sullivan that has dominated architecture and architectural history in the 20th century. Form follows function. He rephrases that. I'm not gonna give the punchline right now already, so I will leave that to him. But it's really, yeah, he reformulates into a new paradigm for architecture and architectural history in the 21st century, I believe. So he compellingly demonstrates that energy or power and fuel in all its forms have really, that are crucial to understand how history has evolved, how it has shaped, but also by retracing that, it also allows us to come up with new ways of dealing with climate emergency issues. And that is also what the Architects Journal said about the book. It's an essential read. It's clarifying, it's alarming, but yet ultimately hopeful, because there is a lot of inspiration and motivation also to retrace in our historical past. And this message of hope, I think, is also very important and significant for the many students and young people around here in the auditorium. So, without further delay, please join me in extending a warm welcome to Barnabas Calder as he takes the stage. And in the meantime, let me also express my gratitude to 𝗍𝗵𝗃𝗏 and especially Lena from the Brussels Center of Urban Studies for really organizing all this and supporting me in this, because they did most of the work, actually. Also Snow from Brussels Academy, we connect the people from Reset to make this all happen. And of course, Barnabas for writing the book and coming to Brussels to enlighten us. The floor is yours.
Thank you ever so much for the invitation and for organizing this, for holding it in, of all the places I've ever spoken, my favorite building to speak in. Fabulous building. And above all, to the real heroes of this evening. Is that producing feedback, or is it just for me? Okay. The real heroes of this evening, who are you for coming on a Friday evening in a city with beer of this quality. So thank you so much for being here. Your wonderful lecture series seeks meaning in the complex historical layering of our cities. You seek to rewind into the past and to fast forward into the future to build a complex and rich understanding of the city. Today, I'm here to do the opposite. I want to simplify our understanding of cities into a single issue. A single issue that shaped the past and that threatens to shape a catastrophic future. And that issue is energy. Let's start with one local example of what I mean. What is the meaning of the atomium? The answer is energy. The name atomium and its shape both celebrate the 1950s optimism about nuclear energy arising from the splitting of the atom. Indeed, the whole of 𝗥𝗏𝗃𝗏, for which it was built, was originally intended, until safety concerns got in the way, to be powered by an on-site nuclear power station that would be one of the exhibits. Energy. The energy context of this enthusiasm for nuclear power in post-war Belgium was that by far the best uranium mine on the planet was in what was then the Belgian Congo. The 𝗙𝗃𝗏𝗁 mine produced uranium that could be up to 65% pure, over 2,000 times purer than that in other mines. It was 𝗙𝗃𝗏𝗁 uranium that the USA used in their wartime Manhattan Project and their post-war nuclear race to produce Little Boy and Fat Man, the two bombs that annihilated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The two highest energy events in human history up to that date. In return for that uranium, America helped Belgium to initiate its nuclear power program. Meanwhile, around the 𝗙𝗃𝗏𝗁 mine itself, miners and those locals whose drinking water was contaminated by the mine have ever since suffered cancers and birth anomalies from the radioactive pollution. And it's also of note that just weeks after Congo's first post-independence prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, expressed doubts about continuing to supply the US with uranium, he was deposed and killed. Energy, it's absolutely central to human affairs. By the way, I highlight this example not because I highlight it because it's local to Brussels, not because I lack examples of terrible colonial activities in my own country in its coal-powered pursuit of the world's resources. But back at the atomium, the optimistic face of this problematic story has every detail of the building being an expression of 1950s energy conditions in a highly industrialized country. The daring structure is only possible because of steel produced using large quantities of coal. It's tethered to the earth by concrete piles, the strength of which comes from cement, which is limestone heated to 1,450 degrees centigrade in order to turn 40% of it into atmospheric carbon dioxide, while the remaining 60% becomes a powder that, when wet, will set into a material nearly as hard as stone. The part of atomium, meanwhile, is a reference to the aluminium triangles that made up the monument's beautiful reflective skin. Only just over a century earlier, aluminium had been shown for the first time at the 1855 Exposition in Paris as a new precious metal, exhibited alongside royal crown jewels. In 1884, it was still so special that it was chosen to be the top 20 centimeters of the Washington Monument, priced at that time at the same cost per weight as silver, because its energy hunger to produce it was so immense. Yet by 1958, you could clad an entire unnecessary monument in it. Similarly, the plastic mastics that originally sealed these joints between the aluminium sheets of the atomium were very new and very energy hungry to produce. As I will show later, only a society with access to abundant, cheap fossil fuels could afford any of these materials at architectural scale. The atomium is exceptional in all sorts of ways, but it is typical in being shaped this closely by energy context. Architecture always is. So much so, in fact, that I proposed a correction to form follows function. This is an extremely lively clicker. Into form follows fuel. It is fuel that most closely shapes how architecture develops, how it functions, what priorities a culture has. Energy context is the single greatest force in shaping buildings, cities, and all other human affairs. And this has always been so. Energy has shaped all of human history and prehistory. Humanity only evolved big brains because of reliable food energy available through the energy revolutions of tools and fire. Over hundreds of thousands of years, our hunter-gatherer ancestors reshaped almost the entire surface of the dry earth through tactical burning of ecosystems using this tool of fire to encourage the growth of edible plants and the gathering together of calorific and tasty animals, to the point where almost all animals and plants on Earth have some level of strategy, on land, have some level of strategy for either surviving fire or regenerating after it, because basically we've burnt everything at least once. We have, in other words, been editing our ecosystems since before we became fully anatomically modern human beings. And therefore, when we're discussing the climate emergency and its allied ecological crises, it seems to me to be a waste of energy and mental capacity to feel guilt about our nature as human beings. We are what we are, and the challenge is to avoid disaster, not to find a way back to some imaginary pristine past. If we go to the earliest buildings to leave substantial trace, they're relatively recent, about 14,000 years ago, which in terms of the history of life on Earth is a blink of an eye. They were built, let's see if I can go forward one slide. They were built as machines to retain heat energy. These houses were built in Ukraine, which at the time was the frozen ice age steppe, ice-covered grassland with mammoths and reindeer living on it. Mammoths and reindeer were so rich in calories that they were worth facing that level of cold, but you had to have a mechanism to keep warm. So you invented architecture. Here are buildings made right at the outset of traceable architecture, though there'll be no doubt millennia of earlier buildings that have disappeared completely, that is there for energy purposes. It's to keep the heat of the bodies and the heat of the fire in so that you don't freeze to death. Even more than this, though, it is made of energy waste products. It is made of mammoth bones and reindeer hides, the bits that are left when you've eaten everything you can chew. Form follows fuel. They were even heated, it turns out, by burning mammoth bones. If any of you has ever accidentally set light to your hair, you will know that the air quality in a building containing burning keratin is horrible, so it must have been an extremely unpleasant smell, but as a Breton saying has it, better warm smoke than cold wind. Hypothermia kills you much faster than lung disease. Form follows fuel. Hunter-gatherers' architecture is usually very unwasteful because they did all the work themselves. So they do just enough to do the things they want to, and then they go and do something pleasanter or something productive of food if they're needing more food. They don't build unnecessarily extra stuff. So hunter-gatherer energy systems, which were enormously diverse, supported human beings and their relatives from several million years ago through the evolution of anatomically modern humans around 200,000 years ago and on into the present. Despite increasingly ubiquitous aggressive marginalization and oppression by agrarian farming states and fossil fuel states over the past 6,000 years. But that is a very small part of what you tend to get told about as architectural history. Almost all the architectural history and urban history entirely is discussed over the last 6,000 years or so, which is the period in which farming states have existed. So rather than finding the energy that existed in your environment, you have changed the landscape in order to produce food for you. So these agrarian states, states whose dominant food source was farmed crops, arose about 6,000 years ago, the first time, exploiting a niche created by the domestication of grasses and animals. And whereas hunter-gatherer energy systems typically used to, and still do where they survive, emphasize energy harvest per person, agrarian states looked at energy produced per unit of land. And this changes people and domesticated animals into tools to operate the land to maximize the energy output. It's therefore a very unpleasant moment for most of the human population that they go from being people with their own agency to being someone else's tool for making crops. And if you look at something like the Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible, shared between three religions, of course, the story of the Israelite people being moved around to Egypt, to Babylon. When farming labor was needed, they were just shipped from place to place because they were tools. And that is a very unpleasant aspect of agrarian life. The outcome of this was that much denser populations could be supported. Several hundred times more people per hectare often than in median hunter-gatherer contexts. And the crops produced on this on fertile land supported a very small elite of people who didn't work the land to get their food. In a hunter-gatherer society, everyone was involved in food production, almost always. In an agrarian society, some people never were. Generation after generation, a family wouldn't touch anything outdoors or tool-like to demonstrate their superiority, and they would instead control other people's production of grain. It produces cities, and it also produces hierarchy. The two come absolutely tightly together. There is a possibility that there are some very early towns that are hierarchy-less and dense, but they certainly don't last long, if so, sadly. Form follows fuel, and this new agrarian elite, which was typically in the region of 5 to 20% of the population who weren't farming, they exploited the rest, who worked unpleasantly hard in the fields, living in poverty with an unhealthily narrow diet. And what they did with this surplus was to produce all the stuff that stands out in the historical record. And when you imagine your way back into ancient times, you probably don't think about subsistence peasants living in squalor. You probably think about the great monuments, the great cities, the great artifacts, the great art forms. But they're a tiny proportion of human activity in this period. Most of the first half of my book looks at the architectural outputs of these sorts of societies and looks at the ways in which quite modest differences sometimes in the ways in which buildings, in which energy systems were constituted, produces different architecture. So I look at things like, here we have on the same slide to the same scale, our hunter-gatherer mammoth bone house and a pagoda in 11th century China, showing you how absurdly big buildings become when there is an elite to decide how big they should be, rather than the people choosing what they build and therefore building the size of a person. The Song dynasty Chinese architectural boom and this incredible burst of efficient systematization that occurs follows a change of rice variety that suddenly, almost overnight, doubles the rice harvest. Similar construction industry effects come from a totally different mechanism of ancient Rome conquering Egypt and therefore being able to import enormous quantities of Egyptian grain across the Mediterranean. So here's the Pantheon, similarly enormously too big for any actual human functions. And the biggest of all the ancient monuments, the Pyramid of Khufu, the biggest of the ancient Egyptian pyramids, again shown to the same scale. At least since the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, people have believed that Khufu must have been appallingly evil to divert this much of his people's energy into building something so stupidly big just to dump his dead body in. Actually, if you take my form follows fuel as a question and say, what is the energy basis of this? Another potential understanding of it arises. It's part of an energy system. It gets rid of seasonal surpluses of human energy. Egypt operated on a basis of seasonal flooding. When the fields were flooded, the farmers moved off the fields and camped on high ground until the floods went back down again, then went back down and farmed. If you have hundreds of thousands of people sitting together, relaxedly eating and talking, they may come to wonder why you're the pharaoh and taking all their stuff. and they may come up with critical thoughts about you. If you make them build 5 million tons of stone in a triangular pile, they don't. They're too tired. They're being driven to keep working. They are kept disciplined, fit, and subordinated, ready for military service, ready to go back to farming, too busy to worry about why they're doing it. It's a sump for surplus energy, seasonal energy surpluses. And I think quite often very, very large building projects have this function in agrarian times of stabilizing society by getting rid of surplus human energy. In any case, the conditions of the agrarian world had two overwhelming realities, and the first was the extreme cheapness of labor if you owned land. If you owned land and had a grain surplus, you could get people to work for just enough food to come back and work again next day. From 1800 BCE to 1300 CE, across a wide range of societies, 𝗙𝗪𝗁 has shown that the overwhelming majority only just fed you enough to keep working or paid you enough to buy the food to keep working. If you wanted to support a family, your children had to go and find a way of earning food from very young. Your partner had to work from right the way through. You couldn't feed a family from the typical labor payments. You couldn't have a house. You just survived. That means that if you're the one with the grain, it's incredibly cheap to get enormous quantities of labor. At these prices, the rulers who are building these projects aren't stretching themselves particularly with the labor costs. Here are some of the French Gothic cathedrals added to the mix, showing you again, even in a much less fertile context than the other three, that you can build very, very big and very effortful if you have this continuous grain surplus. But all that human labor is only so useful because human beings are pathetically weak. We're a terrible energy converter. The 78 million days of hard work that one scholar estimates it took to build the Pyramid of Khufu, if you put that into terms of today's fossil fuel energy system, 78 million days of human labor equates to the lifetime energy use of 7 contemporary Americans. And we're not far behind them in Europe. Fossil fuels have changed the scale of energy use to this incredible extent that any extended family in Europe has the energy resources of Khufu, the most powerful man who had ever lived. So, labor was cheap, but of limited use. What was expensive in agrarian conditions was heat. Heat came from growing plants and burning them, particularly trees. Cooking is non-negotiable even for the poor. Human beings cannot survive long-term on an entirely raw diet. We have evolved with fire. Industry, cooking, and heating all required a limited supply of firewood that grew very slowly, and as it grew, it occupied land that could otherwise be used for food. So in very heavily populated societies, wood becomes scarcer and scarcer and more expensive. In an area as far north as London, a medieval city of 10,000 people required 1 hectare of woodland per person to sustainably meet its heat demands. That quickly adds up to a hell of a lot of land, and given that the roads are bad and wood is bulky and expensive to transport, it puts a limit on the size of European cities further north than the Mediterranean. Energy historians describe these kinds of limits as the photosynthetic constraint. This is the concept that in a given area of land, you have the amount of energy that your plants can turn from sunlight into food or firewood. And that's your total energy. So once you know how much land you have and how fertile it is, you also know your energy budget. And it can go up and down a bit with bad weather and good weather and so on. But essentially, you are operating in a finite quantity, a limited quantity of energy in total. This has enormous implications for their economies and for their architecture. If you think about an industry like glass making or iron making, we are familiar with the modern pattern that the more you do, the cheaper it gets. Economies of scale. The more you do, the cheaper it gets. This is not true in the photosynthetic constraint. For agrarian societies, if you produce more glass, the firewood price goes up. And therefore the price of the glass goes up, and so the market contracts again and the production drops again. And the outcome of it is incredibly clear in this slide of the windows of one of the richest families in the Liverpool area in the 1580s and 90s. They built themselves a really grand house to show off their wealth. Glass windows was one of its great claims to opulence and fame, and this unbelievably shitty quality glass was the best they could do, because there just wasn't enough glass being produced. And you can see the marks of them desperately trying to get it into more or less windowy shape while it's cooling too fast because they can't afford the firewood to make it better. They haven't waited until all the bubbles worked their way out of the molten glass before they made it into window. You can see the metal tool marks where they've tried to crush it flat. You can't see through the windows to their beautiful gardens. In this context, the amazing medieval glass traditions of Cairo and France become all the more spectacular because of their achievement of getting together the heat to get this good at making glass. And it suddenly becomes both an incredible craft achievement and a rather sinister economic decision to use that much of everybody's resources to produce glass this good. So the mystery factor that broke us out of the photosynthetic constraint and has produced extraordinary economic growth worldwide over recent centuries has been fossil fuels. Coal, oil, and gas joining later. With fossil fuels, the more you extract, the more you can invest in extracting more. So rather than wood, where the price goes up the more you use, with fossil fuels, the price goes down the more you use. And the quantity of them available just shoots up and up and up, and continues to do so today, terrifyingly. So the implications of this change for architecture are immense. We routinely use today levels of energy to make building materials that the world in an agrarian system could not possibly have imagined affording. To sustainably furnish the world's current energy consumption for cement production alone, using charcoal, which was the dominant agrarian source of intense heat, wood that has been partially burnt to concentrate its energy stock, to grow enough charcoal to produce all our cement would require the entire output of an area of woodland larger than Australia, just for our cement. You'd need more than the same again for our architectural steel. Our plastics and our aluminium would multiply it up further. To return to the atomium, its energy use for materials would have been unthinkable in an agrarian energy system. Every kilogram of aluminium that went into that building costs an amount of energy equivalent to 1,000 hours of human physical labor for 1 kilogram of aluminium. Every kilogram of plastic is about another 500 hours of human labor. And every kilogram of steel, 300 to 400 hours of human labor. No wonder that agrarian societies spent millions of hours of cheap labor rather than hundreds of hectares of slow-growing wood, so they avoid heat at all cost and swap it for labour. So when you look at the difference between an agrarian monument and an industrial period monument, whoops, here we go again with the... Here we have the Eiffel Tower next to the Pyramid of Khufu, both the same scale. The Pyramid of Khufu weighs about 750 times what the Eiffel Tower weighs. They have remarkably similar energy cost. But the energy cost of the Eiffel Tower is in coal to make the iron, and the energy cost of the Pyramid of Khufu is in sweating farm labourers pushing stones up a hill. So in these circumstances, whilst the social injustices of the agrarian world are totally disgusting, their technical methods for architecture are weirdly cheering, because they tried to minimize heat wherever they could. And it's heat from fossil fuels that is provoking our current crisis. The enormous baths of 𝗙𝗃𝗃 in central Rome, here shown to the same scale as the Pyramid of Khufu to show you that this is really one of the world's very big buildings, still tower over a big area of central Rome, despite 1,500 years of spoliation, of being used as a quarry. But they achieved this astonishing size and solidity using very little heat and very local materials. 76% of the volume of materials in this building came from within 20 kilometers of the site in central Rome during a 300-year-long building boom. So they're exhausting their materials and they can still do it within 20 kilometers. 76%. Less than 6% of the volume requires any heat processing of any kind. The rest is used exactly as it comes out of the ground. Look at modern buildings. They are entirely composed of materials that are intensely treated with heat, fossil fuel heat. So fossil fuels have changed everything about buildings, and half of my book is devoted to the tiny few centuries in which they have come to transform the world. Our long dependency on them in Britain and in Belgium makes us, I think, peculiarly blind to their universality in our built environment. Britain has been dependent on fossil energy since the 17th century, when it copied a load of ideas from Flanders and the Netherlands to produce these brick-built houses with coal-produced everything. Coal-fired brick walls joined together by coal-fired mortar, coal-made glass, which suddenly makes big windows, good quality and cheap for everyone. Coal-forged iron building tools, coal-forged iron nails, hinges, railings, and so on. And these were genuine improvements, big enough to make it worth coping with the increasingly terrible pollution of so many coal fires, industrial and domestic. So fossil fuels make heat incredibly much cheaper. And with the steam engine, this is the station I came through, one of the stations I came through this morning, St Pancras in London. The steam engine, for the first time, allowed heat to be turned into labour, into physical work. And so it drops the price of physical work as well, particularly repetitive physical work, including from the 1850s some aspects of construction labour, because labour costs were going up with rising living standards for the industrial working classes. So suddenly this ancient pattern that heat is very expensive and labour is very cheap totally reverses in a matter of a few decades. And labour becomes expensive and heat becomes very cheap. So the economic pressure is to swap out work wherever you can and swap in the burning of fossil fuels. And that is how we got into the mess we're in, because fossil fuels are a massive downhill slope economically that everything rushes down. The total amount of energy available to industrial societies was so much greater. A 19th century coal miner produced 2,500 times more energy than a medieval farmer. 2,500 times more energy in the system for every single coal miner who's not farming and is coal mining instead. And abundant coal energy magnified everything: scientific understanding, technological development, building booms, the growing diffusion of political power in industrializing countries, but also the scale and ambition of imperialism and colonial exploitation, a grotesque magnification in the shameful British-run trade in enslaved people across the Atlantic, bigger wars, nastier weapons, worse pollution, and vile industrial slums for the poor. Coal energy from Belgium's mining towns built 19th century Brussels, just as coal built British Victorian cities like Liverpool, where I am based. Coal-fired bricks, transported by coal-powered trains, joined together with coal-fired mortar, lit by coal glass windows in the daytime and by coal gas lighting at nighttime. The division that architectural historians make between historicist styles of the 19th century and modernist styles of the 20th century is in energy terms mostly false. By the 19th century, all the energy-hungry materials and services that were to characterize modernism are being experimented with in Britain, in Belgium, and in the few other places that have this intensity of coal extraction. So here, from Liverpool, are a few examples. Here is an 1814 prefabricated flat-pack church made of iron, designed to be shipped out to colonies to de-skill the local population and to force them into Christianity. It's nevertheless very beautiful, however disgusting its origins. And 1814, it's very early. Here is, here is whatever the slide projector decides we're going to see next. Here is a very early, for England, example of 𝗏𝗏𝗃𝗃's concrete system, the Liver building of 1908. Advertising European concrete to American business people coming through. Business people, who am I kidding in 1908? Businessmen coming through Liverpool as a great dock for Europe. Here is a building of the 1850s with completely artificial ventilation and lighting in the 1850s. This is the first generation of human beings who have ever even considered doing that. It has a steam engine in its basement when it's built to pump air through. The air is treated to take the coal smoke out of it and to heat or cool it. And the gas lighting inside lights the building, and the pumped air takes the gas pollution out as well. 1854, that opens. The factory mass production of building components is well underway by the mid-19th century. So, in addition to this building scale situation, city scale change is very rapid during this period, thanks to coal again, the energy of coal. In a complex interaction with colonialism and the trade in enslaved people, coal pushed Liverpool to spectacularly fast growth. Now, this is a fairly large number of quick slides to show change, so wish us luck. Here is Liverpool after 440 years of existence, still a small village. And you can see a little box on the, well, depending on whether I'm standing between you and it, you can see a little red box on the left which shows total energy consumption of England at the time of each of these slides. So this is 1650, energy consumption is very low, coal adoption is very small, and Liverpool is hardly there at all. As coal production creeps up, or the city grows, Gradually, these are in 60-year intervals, so you see the city and the energy production rising. After the train first arrives, the first ever intercity railway line is between Manchester and Liverpool. The steam engine is invented for it, the steam locomotive. And very quickly, the 60 years after this, steam engines and brick carried on steam trains result in this being the next 60 years worth of growth. The change is truly spectacular, and look at what that energy bar has done on the side. It's an absolute leap when the steam engine hits maturity. And into the 20th century, when Liverpool becomes much less important, but all cities just carry on growing in industrialized countries in this period. Back to architecture, and the aesthetics of modernism, the way modernism looks, comes about from the thrillingly overheated reaction of gifted young architects operating in countries which don't have much fossil fuel. They are hit by a fully mature industrial revolution. Belgium and England and Scotland evolved alongside their industrial revolutions. The industrial revolution hit these other countries full speed. And things like futurism, this is a scheme from 1916, and it still looks quite modern now. And it comes from an Italian architect coming into contact with fully developed fossil fuel systems and thinking, wow, but this changes everything. Woo. The modernist villas of the 1920s and 30s are an expression of energy context. They are beautiful, but they are terribly greenhouse-like in hot weather, from all that enormous quantity of glass. And in cold weather, they are essentially a continuous cold bridge. They are freezing cold. They have no insulation. They have very thin concrete walls with steel reinforcement in it to carry the heat through faster. So they're always damp and cold. You have to pour the heat into them from big fossil fuel boilers if you want them not to actually properly freeze you. This is not, and the freedom that they are enjoying to be any shape they like, so that every bit can be an outside terrace and no room ever needs to back onto another room. This is what modernism is about. It's about these freedoms from the age-old Northern European tradition that you huddle the rooms together round the chimneys because otherwise it's bloody cold. You keep each room small enough that one fireplace can keep it comfortable and not too drafty. The Palace of Versailles, the king's bedroom, is not that much bigger than a normal bedroom because it's not very comfy being in a big room with a fireplace. So even if you're having a megalomaniac dream and build Versailles, you still make your bedroom a comfy bedroom size. In this period, fossil fuels mean that you can tear up those rules and build the most impractical houses you like and just put more fuel into the heating system. This is a celebration. Form follows fuel. This is a celebration of fossil fuels being cheap and highly developed. They are gleefully exploring the freedom to heat large, uninsulated, open-plan spaces with powerful fossil fuel boilers. This passionate excitement at the potential of burning too much fossil fuels hits its absolute peak by about the 1960s. This is a scheme by an architect called Cedric Price for an arts centre in London that will be built out of entirely temporary steel structure from which you will hang canvas rooms for whatever purpose you feel like that day, and you will keep them warm by pumping hot air into them all the time. You don't even need to have the canvas enclosing all the sides. You can have an open-sided tent. You just keep the hot air blower turned up nice and high. He even views it from a helicopter in his imagination, because there's always some way of burning more fossil fuels if you only think hard enough. This is an expression of freedom that is the freedom from all the constraints of energy that history has imposed, and of thinking about what you do if you have unlimited energy supplies, and it offers you total freedom. Planning, too, got wildly excited about these things and very challenged by things like car ownership increasing. 𝗙𝗃𝗍𝗂𝗏 and others looked at things like the Lingotto car plant in Italy with its racetrack on the roof and thought, why do we need to accept the idea of ground level at all? Why can't roads go wherever they're wanted in a building or a city? Why can't we build entire cities that are just one amazingly complex, very tall building with an airport on the roof and roads that go straight through the middle and people living 20 stories underground but lit and ventilated artificially? Technically, there was no reason why you couldn't suddenly. And at the Barbican in London and so many other schemes worldwide, they actually do it by the post-war period. In the bottom of this arts centre, you would die in pitch dark of asphyxiation if the power went off for long enough. No one even thinks about it. Probably the case with this room here. So it produces a total change in the way buildings work. So the ravenous energy consumption of our buildings now is not superficial, but fundamental. Form follows fuel shows that modernism is above all else an orgiastic celebration of cheap fossil fuels. Indeed, modernity is arguably the spread of fossil fuels around the world. So we arrive back to the present. Where has this got us? The successful spread of fossil fuels around so much of the world's population means that making and running our buildings is now responsible for 39% of all carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. It's a huge part of the problem of climate change. Human stuff, which is mostly buildings and infrastructure, now weighs more than all living things on the planet put together. And it's concentrated in our cities, which take up more than half of all the stuff that human beings extract from the earth. At present, almost all practitioners and educators and the construction industry globally are trapped squarely in the path dependencies of fossil fuels. Concrete and steel remain ubiquitous default materials, despite their catastrophic carbon footprints. Energy-hungry services continue to whir in most buildings. It's never quiet in a new building. There's always machines working. And in almost all architectural form, in architecture and planning, form making prioritizes too many things over embodied and operational energy. I don't say this in a spirit of blame. We are all, human beings are all snarled up in a fossil fuel world culture which has brought real benefits as well as real problems. But if we want to escape climate catastrophe, we must at least face the truth first. Where blame is more appropriate is when people choose to muddle the public about what's going on. Accelerating towards climate catastrophe whilst telling absurd fairy tales about sustainability. Sometimes the building sector's tactics seem to me to resemble those used by the tobacco industry in previous decades. It's amazing that this even uses that thinks for himself line that alt-right lunatics in tinfoil hats use to justify voting for Donald Trump. This is the tobacco industry spreading confusion over whether cigarettes were dangerous by saying, oh, they were dangerous, yes, but now we've put a little piece of plastic foam at the end of them, they're going to be fine. And it's another 10 years before it's totally clear that everyone's still dying. And they have to come up with the next lie, oh, we'll take the tar out. Why were you putting tar in? The building industry and the materials industries are doing this. They are kicking the can down the road. They're slowing down action against them by talking about sustainability as if they were doing it. Not everybody, not all the time, but that's the general tendency of the sector. And it's really wrong. So, if you accept the validity of my simplification that cities and architecture are part of our energy system, what does it mean for our cities today? What do we need to do? Well, I would call not for a fast forward. That's what fossil fuels do. I would call for an emergency stop. Radical inaction. Doing less and having less. The cycle of profit-led demolition and replacement of viable buildings to make absurd profits, and in some cases, to take the profits of international crime and cleanse them through the building process into money you can spend, which is a major part of the British property market, sadly, to our enormous shame. These are not good causes for so much carbon expenditure. This is a current case in London where this shop in Oxford Street in central London is proposed to be replaced with this, a somewhat bigger version of the same thing. The designers themselves admit that it will cost 40,000 tons of carbon dioxide to do. So how does that compare to our individual actions to save carbon? Well, if you, from tomorrow, stop taking hot showers every morning and you take a cold shower every morning, which in Liverpool and Brussels would be unpleasant for 2/3 of the year at least. If you do that, you will save carbon dioxide. Over a period of time, you could save 40,000 tons of carbon dioxide. It would take you, of daily showers, 680,000 years, but you'd get there in the end, or your descendants would, if we're still here. Or you could just keep the fucking shop that's already there. We have, I acknowledge, massive problems built into our cities from the culture of cheap fossil fuels of the 20th and 21st century so far, which do cause problems for my doctrine of inaction. Perhaps the most serious of these are car dependence and poorly insulated buildings. And we're actively worsening these at the moment by continuing to build leaky, low-density buildings held together by big, hostile roads, which is mad. But so many of our current problems are soluble very simply if we truly want to solve them. We don't at the moment have low-carbon flight options. So I have thought long and hard and come up with this amazing workaround, which is not to fly. We don't have zero-carbon concrete, steel, or aluminium. Almost the whole history of architecture never used them. So it's definitely possible. If they could, in the Bronze Age, build without them, then surely nowadays we can manage it. Wanting to change is a kind of superpower. If we really want to cycle, what proportion of car-dependent housing is truly impossible to cycle from? Some people do have health conditions that prevent them from cycling, but for the rest of us, only a very small proportion of our journeys actually need to involve driving. And we could use car-sharing schemes with very few cars dotted around and just cycle and walk and use public transport. As for our leaky, hard-to-heat buildings, we have to work to improve them to some extent with effective, low-embodied carbon interventions. But perhaps we don't need to change them so radically as we often think. Our definitions of comfort were supplied internationally by a trade organization for selling air conditioning and heating. And amazingly, this trade organization decided the world needed quite a lot of their product. And therefore, in regulations around the world, 21 degrees centigrade is seen as the comfortable temperature, whether the outside temperature is 40 or minus 40. Inside should be 21 degrees because that's how people are comfortable. Now let me sell you this enormous quantity of equipment to keep it at that temperature. Who, other than an air conditioning sales team, wants to be at the same temperature, whether they're in Dubai or Anchorage? The thermal shock of going indoors and outdoors into 21 degrees from extreme temperatures is really unpleasant, to the borders of danger. It compresses our entire experience of these places into, whoops, here we go again. I reckon the oil industry is hacking this computer. 𝗙𝘀𝗃𝗁, in this brilliant book that I hope you have on your radar, describes this phenomenon as thermal beige, everything being the same color in temperature terms, just living in this constant drab 21 degrees. It squashes our experience. If you think about the typical international hotel room, it is a careful deprivation of experience and local character. It takes you to exactly the same temperature. It filters out any smells of the delightful. You get out of the airplane and you smell things. You get into the hotel and you smell nothing. Nothing happens. It's the same temperature. There's the same thrum of air conditioning or heating. You don't even know which. The windows are always covered in curtains just in case you've got a glimpse of culture. It is a very energy-hungry way of depriving you of memories and happiness. This telescopes our memories into, all your memories of being at the same temperature in the same sort of room, just squashed together. Whereas your memories of places that are thermally exceptional are much stronger. If you've ever been in a naturally cool courtyard in a very hot place, or gone into a church in southern Italy in summer, and you hit that sudden drop of temperature and drop of humidity, and it's just beautiful, and it's so memorable, I can feel it. I haven't been anywhere warm for years because I'm trying not to fly. And I can still feel that, and I can't remember what the last 5 hotel rooms I stayed in were like and what country they were in. Partly because it was so damn long ago. So the coziness as well of a single heat source in a room is something that's been known to almost the whole of humanity, where you could place yourself nearer to the heat source when you were cold, and further away from it if you'd just come in from outside and you were hot. You could wear whatever clothes seemed to you the best balance and then sit at the right distance to be genuinely comfortable. And you don't heat everywhere to the same temperature. So many of these sorts of big fossil fuel energy savings would either improve our lives or not much worsen them. And if we abandoned all fossil fuel use tomorrow, we would still be the second most energy-rich society in the whole of human history, just on our current renewables. With ongoing renewable energy expansion, we can get rid of all fossil fuels and still have the things that matter to genuine human happiness: our medicine, our information and communications technology that puts us in touch, and a decent, healthy way of life for everyone on Earth, which is not the case under fossil fuels. Some of the things we need to achieve to avoid climate catastrophe do require individual or collective sacrifice. But when you face the realities of energy and climate, these sacrifices become increasingly tolerable or even natural. One of the great perks, attractions of a life in universities has always been that you got to go places and meet interesting people and discuss things with them. And out of tens of invitations to visit institutions around the world to talk about my book, this is only the second one outside England or Britain that I've been to in person, because all the others would have involved flying. And I would have loved to go to Singapore, Kyoto, Helsinki, Florence, and Turin, but I can't bear that sound of the roar of burning oil from the jet engines as you take off. It mars your pleasure in being there. It's not even a question of kind of halo polishing virtue. It's that it stops being enjoyable once you start to associate it with its dreadful impacts. Who today finds beauty in ivory when you know where it's coming from? Yet the killing of elephants is an incomparably smaller scale of disaster to the extinctions, famines, refugee crises, and wars that are coming down the pipeline if we don't rapidly sort out our situation in relation to climate. We are a censorious generation. We like to make judgments about the past. We pride ourselves on facing and reflecting on the real evils of the past, and we're quite right to do so. But as a world society and as individuals, it is psychopathically culpable for us to conspire actively to continue the greatest evil of the present, which is potentially the greatest harm that humanity has ever committed in its thousands of years of history. And we're doing this just because we're afraid of change and that it might impact our relative comfort relative to other people. How much better to live slower and for us in the rich world live materially poorer, but cycling, wrapping up warmly in winter, treating long-distance travel as an occasional, wonderfully special privilege rather than a way to get sunburnt faster in a banal holiday resort. How much better to nurture our existing buildings and maintain them, adapting them as lightly as possible to meet new needs, like this fabulous building we're in, but more often adapting ourselves to use them as best we can, wisely and well. For the new buildings and areas that we do need, they could be the best the world has ever seen if we get this right. They could return to the local materials and passive comfort technologies that have made each area of the world so distinctive historically. But now doing so with the social democratic ideals that we inherit from the age of coal, and with the sophisticated computational technologies bequeathed to us by oil. We can avoid climate catastrophe and come out into a better world the other side of it. But we do have to really want to, and really want to now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barnabas. I don't know what to add, really. It's the message is so loud and clear. I am guessing that there are questions in the audience. The lights are really blinding us, so we can't really see anything. Is anyone having a question? I can't really see. Okay. We need to speak into the mics because this is being recorded and streamed, so I will try to find you.
Thank you. I didn't want to speak first, but it's always that, like that. So actually, I really liked the presentation, and especially the fact that you connected the price of heat with the price of human labor. I was following that line of thought, but more about today, I was wondering if you also have still some thoughts about it, that energy is getting high. I don't want to assume that the cost of labor going low, but I was wondering how you still see that connection today.
Thank you. It's a fantastically important and interesting question. The recent rises in the price of energy are, in historical terms, non-existent. They are so small relative to the level of change over a longer period that that's something of purely of interest to us who are going through it. You wouldn't be struck by it if you were a medieval person coming into it. The question you ask about the current relationships between labor and energy is a really important and interesting one. It would be, the reason why labor was so cheap in agrarian conditions is because people were treated so badly, and I don't want to go back to that. The way in which we can escape the fossil fuel dependence without going back to a situation where most people need to do terrible, thankless jobs is through renewable energy. But in the case of things like the architecture and planning world, there is a kind of complex relationship between what we need to do and the amount of labor it takes up, where the amount of labor we need for producing new buildings needs to drop. But the amount of labor involved in retrofitting an existing building, in bringing up its environmental performance and adapting it for new uses, is extraordinarily high and extraordinarily human. It's very hard to do a quick click on CAD, computer-aided design packages, and just design a retrofit, whereas you can do that for a new building. So the amount of skilled, thoughtful, human creativity required to adapt the existing world is very high, and it's very important, very attractive work. The amount of labor required to keep churning out largely computer-built, factory-made buildings, I hope is going to tumble downwards because we need to stop doing that. That is the height of the substitution of fossil fuels for human effort. With the dream with renewables is that because they are produced non-centrally, they could produce, and they are available everywhere on the planet, they could produce an era of peaceful coexistence that is the best we've had since ancient hunter-gatherer days, pre-farming, or possibly even including then, because everyone will have their own resources being produced locally, and the great energy wars of the 20th century, which is essentially what most of the 20th century wars were related to. The Second World War is Germany and Japan, which don't have fossil fuels, making a grab for areas that do. Or Germany, post-Treaty of Versailles, had next to no fossil fuels. And so it is trying to seize, through very rapid military action, as much fossil fuel production as it can. And Japan is doing the same in China. And this, that kind of pressure is, you wouldn't invade someone to get hold of their solar panels. So with any luck, if we design it right, a renewable energy world, we'll need to use less energy and use it when it's available. So when the sun comes out, we turn on the machinery, and when it's night and cold, you just wrap up warmer, because particularly if there isn't wind to power the wind turbines, you just get yourself into the mindset of using the energy that's available from your renewables, but then you are freed from the nightmare of oil company lobbying, which controls much of world politics and most damagingly American politics. You're freed from the need to support appalling regimes because they happen to have really good oil wells. And actually, a lot of the industrial activity of the world would be attracted to the parts that are currently poorest because they have the most solar power. solar energy. So there's potentially some really good things to come out of it, but it won't be as simple as labour costs dropping to the point where we do everything through manual labour again, because that's not a good quality of life. So that will be a very unfortunate outcome, and I don't think it would easily support 8 billion people. Sorry, that was a very sprawling answer, but it was a really important and complex question.
Other questions?
There's someone probably further away than the cable will make. But
okay. Hi, thank you for a really interesting presentation. I thought this was a really unique perspective that I'd never heard. And I was curious, you were talking about kind of what we can do currently in the construction sector and using local materials, for example. And I was wondering what your perspective is on kind of, quote unquote, because I don't know, I'm curious what your perspective is, sustainable materials within the building sector, such as like cross-laminated timber and sort of these innovations, and how you see that and where that fits into your perspective.
Thank you. That's a really, really vital question. By far the best material for buildings is the buildings we have, because they're already there, and retrofitting them is always going to be a lower energy option in the current state of things than building something new. The timber is a really complex one, because in theory, when you grow a tree, it takes carbon out of the atmosphere, and if you then turn it into a building, that carbon is not going back into the atmosphere, and therefore you are doing something good. In reality, the process of logging it, the slowness with which it grows, the ecological effects of harvesting too much timber too fast are all very, very problematic. So the idea that we can carry on building as fast as we do, but swap out concrete for timber doesn't work. But the idea that timber is part of a complex palette where we do lots of different things in different situations according to what is locally abundant, according to where we can do it with minimum ecological harms, timber is part of the answer. Cross-laminated timber uses a lot of timber, so it's definitely a lot better than concrete in terms of its carbon outputs. But even then, the best timber practitioners in Britain at the moment are driven wild with anger by the fact that the building regulations require them to put their timber buildings on top of an enormous concrete raft that uses up more carbon, that produces more carbon than the whole of the rest of the building put together. And it's almost impossible not to do it under our current regulations. And yet concrete foundations are only 150 years old or so, maybe a little more than that, 200 years old. Before that, all buildings were built without concrete rafts, and there's a hell of a lot of them still standing. So clearly those technologies work fine, and we just need to rediscover them and improve them and adapt them, because we're very, very good at engineering now in a way that we've never been in the whole of human history before. So we can design things more economically. If we're designing in stone, we can use less stone. We can design it in a way that's more robust against earthquakes or other threats. But using the past architecture of the area as a guide, but then also adding to that a caution about accidental other effects and about the total scale of what you're doing, gets you towards a more sustainable way of doing things. Great question, thank you.
Hello, thank you for the presentation, and to your organizers for organizing the event. I'm a student of urban studies. I've already raised this question within one of our classes once, but I'm still looking for the answer. You somehow touched the part of food industry and farms which have impact on environment and ecology. I'm just wondering if you think that if we push food industries, animal-based companies to stop consuming animal-based food, and if we encourage companies to turn into plant-based food industry, will it be a call for radical inaction? And can we call them a radical act of care?
It's a really, really important question, and it's one on which I am massively hypocritical, because I still eat meat and other animal products out of simple lack of self-control. Radically cutting the amount of animal farming is certainly a very, very productive thing to do. Sometimes these things get really messy because, for example, if you are going to continue consuming some animal protein, one of the most sustainable forms of animal protein is horribly abused chickens. Battery farmed chickens are very much better ecological profile per gram of protein than most other forms of protein, non-plant protein at least. So sometimes you get these horrible situations where things don't all align towards benevolence, and there are conflicting interests of animal welfare versus carbon cut. But obviously the most carbon cutting way of doing it is to move to very unprocessed plant-based diets. The difficulty is the very unprocessed, where the current way in which the food industry is mostly seems to be making the shift is through incredibly highly processed pseudo-meat products, which is a deranged worst of both worlds, because they're actually not, the energy profile can get quite bad with them. They're probably pretty unhealthy because of the level of processing. And yeah, they're just a kind of a nightmarish compromise. The cultural shift of moving to eating meat, if at all, as an occasional indulgence rather than as a systematic part of every meal is definitely one that would save an enormous amount of carbon dioxide equivalent, particularly methane, as you no doubt know from dairy animals and beef animals and sheep. I think that also then potentially opens up land for rewilding, because meat and animal products tend to have a very much lower output of calories per hectare than plants. But the directions of almond milk and soy are promoting enormous quantities of environmental devastation in places where they're being radically over-farmed, thanks to a kind of an industrial attachment to them in the vegetarian and vegan food heavily processed end of the industry. So these things are incredibly complex, and when you slide, I think it comes back to the question of whether you truly want to solve the problem. And if enough people truly want to solve the problem, then these kind of gestural things that just make you feel a bit better because it says on the packet that it's sustainable become less viable. And as I'm sure you are, well-informed, ethical consumer who makes clever, correct choices about these complicated issues drives the right kind of change. The difficulty at the moment is the kind of simple marketing tricks that are being played on food just as they are on buildings, of saying one thing on the packet, and what does sustainable mean? When you see it written on a piece of packaging or on a hoarding of a building, what are they actually claiming? And the answer is there is no definition that enables you to say for sure that's not sustainable. You're lying the way you can if they say it's 20% fat and you measure it and it's 50% fat, you can say, right, we're now taking you to court for lying. You can't do that with sustainable, and therefore it's a loved word because it can mean so little. So in other words, it's too complicated, but if we really care and try hard enough, we can fix it.
Thanks for an excellent presentation. I really learned a lot. Also, not being an architectural historian, so it's nice to sort of see something from outside of one's own field. I have one theoretical question, which is how does this relate to the claims around radical inaction? How does it relate to the claims around degrowth, which, let's say, the broader social sciences, perhaps a kind of topical concern? And a practical question is, you say, okay, we have enough buildings already, basically. So in a way, that's the end of the building industry. At least we reduce the building industry to the kind of retrofitting, or let's say renovation works. But from a planner's point of view, the mainstream argument always put forward is, it's not so much that we might have enough buildings, but they are also in the wrong place. So let's say from an urbanist point or an urban planning point of view, often it's the case, well, yes, we have a lot of buildings, but we actually need to get more buildings into the cities. So a lot of the construction industry, mainstream politics is often about, actually, we don't have enough housing, so we need to build more housing. And then let's say the slightly deviating perspective might be, yeah, but if we just start renovating offices, blah, 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 then actually we might have enough. So how do you see your claims in relation to this, the spatial dimension of this, so to speak, or the planner's dimension?
It's enormously complicated, isn't it? I think that sometimes that's a really important structural challenge, and sometimes it's an excuse for business as usual. And it's the boundary between those is extremely hard to detect. So there are definitely kind of right-wing, borderline climate change denying lobby groups in Britain, and I'm sure they're not unique, who make this argument on the basis of kind of their love of public transport and their desire for bus routes to be economically viable and so on. And it just stinks of lies and manipulation. But there are obviously huge advantages to a certain level of increased density in terms of urban transport, and other factors. I think the thing that needs factoring in when making calculations about them is time to payoff and certainty of payoff. So if, for example, you build a substantial new concrete building in a city centre that replaces a lower density building that was already there, say, and you do so because an increase in density will improve the environmental profile of the city over time, when is that going to pay off? And will it ever pay off the fact that the enormous carbon burden of producing the new building is right now? And right now is the worst time to emit carbon because it stays up there for 800 years. And so if we emit it today, then it's every single day that it's heating. Whereas a saving that we make to urban transport in 60 years' time is speculative, assuming that we continue to have a fossil fuel dependent urban transport system, and is assuming that there's still a civilization worth living in 60 years' time, which if we build enough buildings in city centres in the name of density, there may not be. So I think it's the right thought for 60 years ago. And if we'd moved to lower carbon ways of constructing and to increasing density in the lowest carbon ways we could 60 years ago, we would now be in a massively better position. But I'm not clear that it's a good excuse for business as usual. I don't, incidentally, think that the building industry needs to go away forever. I think it needs to pause until it's got a better way of doing it. So I'm not calling for, I'm definitely not calling for people who aren't well housed to lump it. I'm calling for us to prioritize what we build, to replace fewer offices with similar offices, which is one of the major building types that just cycles and cycles and cycles because you get more money for a brand new office, and actually because the finance process of building a new office building makes you money irrespective of the outcomes of the office building. And therefore there's this insane structural subsidy for pointless reconstruction. And the definition of A-class office space changes every few years in order to justify pulling down all the A-class office space of a few years before and replacing it with something that's functionally identical, costs 40,000 tons of carbon dioxide, and makes them more money, which is so sick that it just could make some of these stains on the carpet. Sincerely working out ways of densifying at very, very low carbon is a fabulously important and valuable project. But sometimes saying to people, if you're going to live in that crappy out-of-town suburb, you're going to have to cycle further. So it needs to be part of how we're thinking about this. And if you really care, you can cycle a long way if you're not, if you don't have some specific health reason why you can't.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. I'm also an urban studies student, but until 2 months ago, I was in Japan and working with cities in Japan and their climate action plans. And so I want to ask about your perspective on the policy dimensions, like what the cities can do in terms of the carbon goals. And to share a little bit about what I used to do is that in Japan, it's the Ministry of the Environment asked the cities to, first of all, declare that they're going to go the net neutral by 2050. Then basically it's divided, the emissions are divided into 4 sectors: industry, business, households, and transport, and come up with policy solutions for each sectors, basically. And for industry, cities cannot do much, so let the companies, let them meet their goals on their own, kind of. And for household, it's usually the solar rooftop subsidies. And transport, it's changing to the electric vehicle. And for business, it's we call them zero energy building. It's the energy efficient building, use that and use new technologies to reduce the emissions. So I was wondering if you have any other policy suggestions.
Yeah, I don't know the specific case, so it may be that it's handling this superbly. The thing that tends to be enormously problematic about these sorts of initiatives, the ones that I've seen enough of to have a clear sense of what's going on with them, is that they tend to focus almost exclusively on operational carbon and don't pay any attention to their embodied carbon. So the carbon cost of replacing an entire fleet of urban vehicles with battery-powered things is vast. And their life isn't particularly good, so it's an ongoing cost. And there's issues of resource scarcity for batteries on top of it. There's a wonderful website, which I referenced on one of my slides because I nicked it from it, called 𝗏𝗏, which advocates things like the fact that looking back a short distance, because our energy levels have risen so fast that even if you go back 50 years, you find lower energy solutions. And he points out things like the fact that if you, instead of having battery-powered urban vehicles, you just put some overhead electricity lines back in and run them off that. and then you can run them off renewables straight without the battery cost, and the whole cost, the energy cost of making that infrastructure is hugely lower, and the efficiency with which it uses the electricity is hugely better, and therefore it's just a really simple way of improving it. And they don't tend to like things like that, because the whole basis on which policy tends to be made at the moment is on the assumption that our current standard of living is slightly too low at least. So how can we continue to improve our standard of living while simultaneously decarbonising? And the answer to it is very, very simple, that we can't. And therefore, the intellectual basis is fundamentally flawed. They ignore embodied energy or embodied carbon costs, and they use the magic word net, which means we're making it up. Net zero is such a bag of shite. It's really embarrassing. I used it in my book because it's the official policy, and I really regret it. I should have just taken it on, because what we actually need to do is measure reductions, not pay some money to some international gangsters to claim they're not chopping down some forest somewhere, which is what a lot of carbon compensation schemes currently are. We're back in a situation like the later stages of the medieval church, in Christian church, where they were literally taking money from people and saying, right, give me enough money and you won't go to hell. And we're back to doing that with equal levels of robustness, that we give money to some random crooks to allow us to say that things are net zero. And it's a terrifying. And even so, we're not bloody managing it. That's the really scary thing. Even while lying about it, we're not actually managing anything like net zero. We're still increasing our emissions in most of the world. So I'm hugely worried by the net zero side of it. I'm concerned about whether they're including embodied emissions, and I'm concerned that this absolute obsession with always maintaining at least the current level of luxury of everything we do is a necessary part of it, and that's the inflexible thing, and then we work out if we can chip away at the carbon within those limits. And we can't, so we need to change how we're living as well. So thank you for the question. I'm sorry to have such a horrible answer.
Crime, maybe I can throw in the punchline that I remember from the book, that patio heaters should simply be forbidden, that it's a crime in itself.
Yeah.
I saw a question. Yeah, the cord is not long enough.
First, I also wanted to second the appreciation for this presentation. It was very enlightening. My question, and I'll preface this by saying I come from the US, and I actually grew up in Texas, so a place that has a lot of energy expenditure. And I was curious about the entire cities and regions that have become heavily populated, especially in the US context, where their whole existence is predicated upon the embodied carbon of massive highway systems, water infrastructures, massive costs of ventilation and cooling. And what your argument would mean for those places, like at least in the US, are some of the fastest growing parts of the country. For the city of Phoenix, Arizona, which has a triple crisis of rising water insecurity, the energy costs to heat or to cool in particular, is the question of not like abandonment per se, but like what would you sort of say to someone who is in a context like that, there's all these unsustainable practices that radical inaction seems to not be the right move, but it also is a big question mark. So I'm just curious about your thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, it's a really, really important and huge question. Coming from a place where the main problem is being slightly cold, I have in some ways a kind of luxurious view of these things, because we can't yet afford to do the retrofit we want to on our house, which in Liverpool, which is cheap to buy houses in, if we do it to the standard that we would ideally do it to, it will cost nearly the same as it cost to buy the house in the first place. And we can't assume that many people will want to do that. But we can't afford it at the moment. And therefore, we just turn the heating right down and we wear thermal onesies all through the winter. And it's, it's not very comfortable, but we don't die. Meanwhile, and when the sun comes out, you open all the blinds and sit in the room with the sun. The cats are always a good guide to where to be in a cold house. They have an incredibly good sense of how to operate a house passively. So heat is more often at the moment in more of the world becoming a lethal problem. And obviously, air conditioning has enabled the development. If places like Florida were basically uninhabited and uninhabitable, that's an exaggeration, but they were very difficult to inhabit, and the death rate from tropical diseases and heat exhaustion was high until the 1920s, when air conditioning enabled very, very rapid growth there. And therefore, it has co-evolved as an urban setting with air conditioning that is in hot, humid environments, basically already necessary for health and getting more necessary as the heat and humidity rise. I don't propose that we switch it all off and let people evolve or die. That's what I do propose is that there's a balance to be struck between 21 degrees and dying of heat exhaustion. And it's not near the 21 degrees end of the spectrum that you can survive really fine well into the 30s. And you can save so much of the energy cost of air conditioning by going up 10 degrees. And just dress a bit lighter. Why does everyone in every office worldwide need to wear a business suit and therefore air condition or heat accordingly? Why can't we wear different things that work for the climate? Why in very hot places do we not have siestas anymore, where you just go home and go to sleep for a bit during the worst bit of the day and get back up again and do your work into the evening? These are adaptations that are really easy to make. They're very low energy in themselves. They're just cultural adaptations. If we want to do them, we can. Now, getting Texas to want to do them isn't something I have a magic bullet for. I don't have a solution for that side of things. And I'm terrified by the culture war implications of all this at the moment, where, for example, renewable energy is now getting referred to as woke in an entirely pejorative sense, in an entirely negative sense by the right wing across Britain and America. And it scares me rigid because, we know for sure that Republican politicians are willing to die for their culture wars because all these overweight elderly politicians cuddled each other throughout COVID just to demonstrate that they didn't care about COVID, and they had quite a high risk of dying of it. And if they're willing to risk their own lives, then how much more are they willing to massacre their grandchildren? So I'm very scared of the intense political challenge that's getting worse all the time at the moment, and definitely being actively promoted by people who are profiting from business as usual. But the technical problems, I think, are largely soluble, because at the points where it's too hot and you need the air conditioning, you could have an awful lot of solar power running, and you can run air conditioning to an adequate level of comfort entirely off solar power in a way that means that you could carry on living there fine. The water is more of a challenge because the American water system for at least a century has involved enormous amounts of fossil-fueled extraction of groundwater, which means that the groundwater level has dropped so far across much of the center of the United States that the aquifers are looking increasingly in danger of fully running out. And at that point, the whole area desertifies, and I don't know what you do then. That might be a point of abandonment, but that's from a wider ecological collapse rather than from the specific challenge of living in hot places where you get the solar on, you turn the thermostat right up in air conditioning, and it saves you most of the problem.
Was another question? We have time for 1 or 2 questions. Wasn't there another question from somebody in the back? No?
There's a hand over here otherwise, I think.
All right, thank you. And especially thank you for being so practical and at the same time not boring, which is something not many people can do. And so my question is on the concept of energy poverty, which seems to be kind of a buzzword. It's very interesting to look at energy poverty across different neighborhoods, different cities, but the definition of energy poverty sometimes is based on, for example, a certain temperature that you can keep in your room in summer or in winter. And I was just wondering whether your argument would be that some people that we consider energy poor are actually not, and they should just adapt.
No, I'm not sure I would. I'm not sure I certainly wouldn't feel comfortable with that as a position. So if I end up taking it, I'll have to think it through more first. I think the thing that is horrifying about the kind of naked market solutions to these things is that they hit some people to the point of total catastrophe before they make any difference to others. So if in the recent energy price rises, some people have ended up literally dying from lack of energy availability in cold parts, and others are still flying their helicopters. And that is a terrible way of determining the distribution of resources, obviously. Energy poverty is, I think, enormously important as an issue. And what is required is a just energy restraint rather than a kind of blanket slashing of availability of energy that hits some people much harder than others. So in the Second World War in Britain, food was scarce because Britain had become, through its coal and empire wealth, a massive food importer by the mid-19th century. And therefore, when it was hit by war conditions, it was really struggling to feed its population. And rather than just allow prices to shoot up, they instituted a rationing system where even the very rich had to have only such and such grams of meat per week, such and such grams of fat per week, and such grams of carbohydrate per week. Obviously, it wasn't grams, it was England's insane weights and measures of the time. But it meant that one of the interesting effects of it was that the very poor ended up better nourished because it ended up allowing them better access than under the simple market of the pre-war period or the interwar period. And the rations were adequate, and therefore, because the country was, never occupied and was lucky to have the sea there and lucky to have just enough resources to get it through. So people ended up, on average, probably slightly better for the rationing. Rationing is not a particularly easy thing to sell to people, but it's a much better model than a simple market model of restraint where, the rich just continue to consume hundreds of times as much as the poor. And obviously when you add that, when you look at it in a world context, we're dealing with a very complex situation where a huge proportion of the world's population are currently living in conditions which are dangerously lacking in medical and sanitary conditions that we would think are basic human rights, rightly. But if you add flushing water lavatories to all the places that don't have them, you're exacerbating pollution crises and water crises because it's not a very good piece of technology. So how we handle these really complex issues of continuing to improve the conditions of those whose conditions are not good enough, slightly worsening the conditions of those who, in some respects, of those who have much more than they need, and who are made, after all, much less happy and much less healthy by driving rather than cycling, and by living in excessive sized houses, and by always being at the same temperature and so on. These are not good conditions to live in. It's a kind of, it's this sort of living conditions equivalent of living in a sweet shop and eating nothing but chocolate and sweets. It's sort of a childish desire for a perception of luxury that isn't actually a good quality of life. But how you get people, I think knowledge is the key to it. Because a really cheering thing that's coming out of my next book is that human beings have an astonishing ability to design their culture around their energy system in such a way that they don't wipe themselves out. And we are a very unusual generation in currently knowing that we're wiping ourselves out and not taking the cultural action to sort it out. But now that we know, quite a lot of us are taking quite a lot of actions. I bet that everyone in this room puts some thought into it, does some things differently from the way they'd have done them 10 years ago, is looking for more ways of doing so, would vote for things that would improve the situation. And we're not the only people in the world who are feeling like that. If we can get enough people to ignore the active lie campaigns of business as usual, and to find just enough about it to know that these are good actions and these are bad actions and these are good policies and these are bad policies, then we're totally able to sort this out and to want the restraint. Because people don't just always want more. It's a capitalist myth. People have always regarded some forms of restraint as being virtuous.
Final question?
That's great to hear that optimism coming from you. I think, though, that it seems like one of the challenges with climate change is individual action is great, and yeah, I do it too. I try to make changes. I live differently than I did 10, 20 years ago. But individuals, we don't see the impact of what we do. We don't see the climate getting better. We don't see the wider world changing. And so it's very hard to continue with that and to keep going. And for a lot of people, they're just like, why bother? Because my little bit isn't going to do anything. So at what point does it have to get more, I don't know, I guess top down, where we do start telling people they have to change?
Yeah, it's a really important question. It's a question for specialists in behaviour change rather than specialists in architectural history. But I think top-down's unlikely to be very successful in sort of Western European and American contexts, because already, the government in Britain, some of the local governments in Britain started suggesting that it would be quite nice if there were shops within walkable distance of new housing, and therefore the housing was dense enough. And there were protests in the street in which there was violence because of the level of opposition to that idea, because it was stirred up by right-wing villains wanting to maintain car sales and just be arseholes and all the things that these people seem to want to do. So I think trying to impose it is probably not very straightforward, or at least trying to impose it on voters is not very straightforward. Imposing it on industries and the like is very straightforward and the right thing to do.
To bring it back to the building trade or the architectural trade, I mean, just thinking about like the local permitting process, like here in Belgium, they're starting to impose restrictions on landlords or home buyers that they have to, upgrade the energy efficiency of their home within a certain number of years and add conditions like that. I mean, do you advocate that kind of thing, like in the building permit process as well, saying to people, you have to, reduce your emissions in order to get a permit or that kind of thing?
Yeah.
Does that work? I mean,
yeah, I think you can do it to the business-facing end of the building industry like that, and should. For householders, you need to take them with you, and you need them to understand why, and you need to help them with it, and you need to offer them tax breaks or subsidies to help them with it, because when things cost people money, they very quickly listen to whatever nonsense will justify them opposing it. With when people find, people don't love big business. There's not a kind of emotional attachment to it. When they discover that the construction projects of big business are producing such insane emissions, they're not against the idea of stopping that. That's not a thing that they feel the impact of in a negative way, and it's just so clearly right that the middle ground people are okay with it. The danger of pushing in the wrong ways without enough support and with too much in the way of pushing is that it ends up counterproductive, and people radicalize as conspiracy theory nuts who just don't believe in climate change, even though it's completely visible around them all the time, yearly changing in a way that you can actually perceive. I mean, in Britain this summer, when the whole of southern Europe was in that catastrophic heat wave, and there were those devastating fires, there were right-wing Twitter accounts and things circulating photos of acts of arson that probably were nothing to do with, probably 10-year-old films and quite likely from something fictional originally, but saying this is what's actually happening. It's climate activists burning down the forests to prove that it's to prove the existence of climate change. People will believe anything if it fights their sense of self-interest, and therefore helping people to understand that their self-interest is not to maximize their energy consumption this year, but to leave a planet worth living on for their old age and their children is also a priority. So I think that complex process of the right forms of coercion for the people who need coercing, for the organizations that need coercing, and the right forms of persuasion and seduction and spreading of conviction for everyone else is the way that we can save this. But it's obviously, the budget for making this case is a lot smaller than the budget for fighting this case, because the oil industry is basically the world's economy. That's, energy is the economy. The money is a proxy for energy. The energy economy of farming started first. The money was brought in as a more convenient way of carrying energy around. And it remains a kind of faulty proxy for energy. And the oil industry is absolutely enormously powerful, therefore. They haven't had to flex those muscles particularly because people aren't trying hard enough. But, I'll know that I'm starting to make some kind of difference with this case when somebody drives over me on my cycle to work. Because it's very, very cheap to get someone killed in Liverpool. It's very unflattering that they haven't bothered. That's a nice note to end on, I think.
Indeed. Let's end it with that. Thank you very much. I think, given the number of questions, it's... I think we all support you in that message that you are trying to convey. We are also looking forward to the next book you're working on. Let's hope you can get the title 𝗵𝗿𝗁 for that one. And then it just leaves me to invite you to the next lecture in this series, which is on November 10th by 𝗻𝗿𝗏, and it will be hopefully equally interesting. The bar is open.
Thank you all.